$187,340. That's the number my accountant read out loud to me on a Tuesday afternoon in March, sitting in a beige office that smelled like burnt coffee, sliding a printout across the desk like it was a diagnosis. That's how much my mother took from me over 11 years. Not in one dramatic heist, not in some Hollywood con. In small, deliberate cuts. A co-signed loan here, a temporary transfer there, a credit card opened in my name while I was in the hospital recovering from a car accident and couldn't so much as sign my own discharge papers. But the money was never the worst part. The worst part came on a Thursday in October in front of 41 of my coworkers in the middle of our quarterly all-hands meeting when my mother, a woman I had not invited, had not spoken to in 5 months, and explicitly asked in writing to stay away from my job, walked through the glass doors of my office wearing a mink-trimmed coat she bought with a credit card that had my name on it, and announced to the entire room that I was, and I am quoting her exactly, a compulsive liar who stole from her own family and doesn't deserve the job she's sitting in. She thought that would be the end of me. She thought I would fold the way I always had, quietly, privately, apologizing for a crime I didn't commit just to make the discomfort stop. She was wrong. And what she didn't know, standing in that lobby in her stolen coat, feeding off the silence of a room full of strangers, was that I had already spent 4 months building a case against her. A financial case, a legal case, the kind of case that doesn't care about tears at Thanksgiving or guilt trips at Christmas. The kind of case built on bank statements, notarized signatures, and timestamps. That morning in the office was supposed to be her victory lap. It was actually the last public appearance my mother ever made as a free woman. This is the story of how I built the case that ended it, dollar by dollar, document by document, and how a woman who spent 3 decades weaponizing my own name against me ended up learning at 59 years old that theft doesn't stop being a crime just because the thief calls you sweetheart while she's doing it. Before we go further, I want to be upfront about something because I think it matters for a story like this one. This isn't a story about revenge for the sake of revenge. It's not about humiliating someone just to watch them squirm. Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how much restraint that took. This is a story about greed, about betrayal wearing a mother's face, and about the long, unglamorous, paperwork-heavy process of getting every single dollar back, legally, methodically, and permanently. If you're new here, this channel is dedicated to true financial recovery stories, the ones where ordinary people go up against fraud, theft, and manipulation and win, not with a lucky break, but with documentation. If that's the kind of story you find satisfying, hit subscribe now, because we release a new case study every week, and this one, I promise you, is one of the most thorough financial takedowns I've ever told. Stick around until the end because I'm also going to walk you through the exact warning signs I missed for over a decade, so that if you're watching this and something feels familiar, you can catch it years before I did. Quick roadmap for what's ahead. We're going to start with how the trust got built in the first place, because you can't understand a theft like this without understanding the 11 years of access that made it possible. Then we'll walk through the discovery, the single rejected mortgage application that cracked the whole thing open. From there, the investigation, the credit reports, the bank statements, the county records, and the exact document that became what I call throughout this video the smoking gun. And finally, the part I think you're going to want most, the settlement, the criminal case, and the twist about where the money actually went. Let's get into it. My name, for the purposes of this story, is Renee. I'm 36 years old, I work in mid-level operations management for a logistics firm in the Midwest, and for most of my adult life, I thought my biggest financial risk was the stock market. I didn't understand until my early 30s that the biggest risk to my finances wasn't a market crash or an identity thief in some overseas call center. It was my own mother, Diane. To understand how Diane was able to take $187,340 from me over 11 years, you have to understand the architecture she built long before there was ever a dollar amount involved. Financial abuse, and I didn't even know that phrase existed until my lawyer used it in our second meeting, doesn't start with money. It starts with access, and access, in a family, starts with trust that's never been tested. Diane raised me and my younger brother Mark alone after our father left when I was 9. She told everyone, teachers, neighbors, our extended family, that she'd sacrificed everything for us. And on paper, that story worked. She held down a job as an office administrator, she kept the lights on. From the outside, she looked like a single mother who'd done an admirable job. What people didn't see was the emotional ledger she kept. Every meal, every school supply, every ride to soccer practice was tallied. Not out loud, not at first, but I could feel it. By the time I was a teenager, I understood instinctively that love in our house was conditional and the currency was obedience. I remember one specific moment from when I was 15 that I didn't understand the significance of until I was 36, sitting across from that accountant with his printout. I'd wanted to get a part-time job at a local ice cream shop, mostly for spending money and a little bit of independence. Diane refused to sign the working papers I needed as a minor, telling me, "I don't need you having your own money right now, I need you focused on this family." At the time, I read it as strictness. Looking back, with everything I now know, I read it very differently. Control over my income, even at 15, even before there was any real income to control, was never incidental. It was the pattern, showing up years before the pattern had a name. Here's where it gets specifically financial, and I want to walk through this carefully, because the pattern is one a lot of you watching this will recognize from your own families. When I turned 18, Diane insisted on being added as an authorized user on my very first credit card. "So I can teach you responsible spending," she said. I agreed. It felt normal. It felt like something a mother does. For the first 2 years, she genuinely did teach me something. She'd sit with me once a month, show me the statement, explain interest rates, walk through the difference between the minimum payment and the actual balance. I want to be fair to that period because it's part of why everything that came later worked so well. The early lessons were real. The trust they built was earned honestly before it was later spent dishonestly. When I bought my first car at 22, Diane co-signed the loan because my credit history was thin. Reasonable, common, the kind of decision financial advisors actually recommend for young adults when the co-signer is trustworthy. I made every payment on that loan myself on time for the full 5 years, and I remember feeling proud that I'd never once needed to lean on her financially the way I'd initially feared I might. That pride, in hindsight, is exactly what made the later loans feel so reasonable to grant her in return, a sense of reciprocity that, on my side, was completely genuine, and on hers, I'd eventually learn, had been the plan from the very beginning. At 26, when I was saving for a down payment on a condo, Diane offered to hold $9,000 of my savings in a joint account for safekeeping so you're not tempted to spend it. I want you to sit with that phrasing for a second, because it's a script. It's not unique to Diane. Financial predators, and yes, family members absolutely qualify, use the language of protection to justify taking control. I'm just watching it for you. I don't want you to make a mistake. You'll thank me later. At 29, after the car accident I mentioned earlier, I was in the hospital for 6 days with a fractured pelvis, and Diane had power of attorney over some of my affairs for exactly that window. A temporary, medically necessary arrangement my brother and I had set up years earlier in case anything happened to either of us. It was supposed to expire the moment I was discharged and lucid. That's the moment. I know now, looking back at bank statements, that a Capital One card was opened in my name.
I didn't find out for 2 more years. Looking back, I can count at least 6 distinct red flags I either dismissed or rationalized. Red flag 1, Diane never wanted to discuss money in front of my brother. Every financial conversation happened one-on-one, privately, so we don't stress out Mark. Isolation is the first tool in almost every financial abuser's kit, separating the target from anyone who might ask questions. Red flag 2, she always had an explanation ready before I even asked a question. If a balance looked off, she had the story prepared before I could react. That kind of preloaded explanation is something legitimate financial situations rarely require. Genuine mistakes get discovered and then explained. Diane's explanations arrived suspiciously fast. Red flag 3, she discouraged me from using budgeting apps or reviewing my own statements. "You're so anxious about money, just let me handle the boring stuff." At the time, it sounded like generosity. In hindsight, it was denial of access to my own information. Red flag 4, small loans that were never repaid, and any attempt to bring them up was met with tears, guilt, or a rotating cast of health complaints that always seemed to flare up right when repayment came up in conversation. Red flag 5, she loved being seen as generous in public, buying rounds at family dinners, showing up with expensive gifts for my nieces and nephews, while privately telling me she was barely scraping by and needed help. The math never added up, and I never asked her to show her work. Red flag 6, the biggest one. Every time I set even the smallest boundary, asking for the joint account to be closed, asking her to stop using my card, Diane escalated emotionally, fast and hard. Crying, accusations of ingratitude, occasionally threats to cut off contact with my kids, her grandchildren. I now understand that pattern has a name: DARVO. Deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. I didn't know the term back then. I just knew that every boundary I'd tried to set cost me more emotionally than it was worth, so I mostly stopped trying. Red flag 7, she kept physical copies of my identification documents just in case, long after any legitimate reason for having them had expired. A photocopy of my driver's license from a rental application in my early 20s, a copy of my social security card, ostensibly kept for taxes one year and never returned. At the time, asking for them back felt like accusing her of something unthinkable. In hindsight, every one of those documents became a tool she eventually used. I want to pause on something here, because I think it's the part of this story viewers relate to most, even more than the dollar amounts. None of these red flags, on their own, would have been enough to make anyone suspicious. That's exactly the point. Financial abuse inside a family doesn't announce itself as a single alarming event. It's built from 100 small, individually forgivable moments, each one plausible in isolation, that only become visible as a pattern once you lay them end to end, which is precisely what I eventually had to do, on paper, spread across my kitchen table, to finally see the whole shape of it. The single largest transfer happened when I was 32. Diane came to me in tears, saying she was 3 months behind on her mortgage and facing foreclosure. She asked for $22,000, framed as a loan with a handshake promise to repay it within a year once her disability claim came through. I remember the specific setting because I've replayed it so many times since. We were at her kitchen table, the same table I'd grown up doing homework at, and she'd laid out a stack of papers she said were the foreclosure notice and the payment history. Papers I'd never actually read closely, because reading them closely in that moment would have felt like an accusation. She said, "I've never asked you for anything like this before, Renee. I wouldn't ask if I had any other option." I believed her completely. Looking back at the county records I'd eventually pull, I now know those papers on the table that day could not have been a real foreclosure notice, because no such filing ever existed.
I don't know, to this day, exactly what those documents actually were. A forged notice, papers from an unrelated situation, or simple bluffing with blank stationery. My attorney told me it didn't ultimately matter for the case. What mattered was that the underlying crisis was fabricated, and the documents, whatever they were, existed only to make the fabrication convincing. I want to be honest with you, I had doubts, even then, but I also had a lifetime of conditioning that told me that questioning my mother's honesty was itself an act of betrayal. So I liquidated part of a retirement account, taking an early withdrawal penalty that cost me almost $3,000 on top of the $22,000 itself, and I wired her the money. There was no loan agreement, no signature, no interest rate, just a promise and a hug and a "you're such a good daughter" that at the time felt like the biggest compliment of my life. That $22,000 was never repaid, not $1 of it, and it was, as I'd later discover, only about 12% of the total. By the time I turned 35, between the unauthorized credit card, the held savings that quietly shrank instead of grew, 3 more emergency loans ranging from $4,000 to $18,000, and a car she took out in my name using a copy of my ID she'd kept for emergencies since the hospital stay, Diane moved $187,340 through my name, my credit, and my accounts. I didn't know the full number yet. I wouldn't know it for months, but I was about to find the first thread that would unravel the entire thing. Before I move into the discovery, I want to spend a minute on something that I think gets skipped over too quickly in stories like this one: the social scaffolding that let this go on for 11 years without a single relative raising an eyebrow. Diane wasn't just careful with paperwork, she was careful with narrative. She had, over decades, cultivated a reputation in our extended family as the martyr, the single mother who'd given up everything, who never remarried because she didn't want to confuse the kids, who worked double shifts during the years I actually remember her working at most 40 hours a week. Every family gathering, that story got a little more polished. By the time I was in my 30s, it had calcified into something nobody questioned anymore, including me. That mythology did real work. It meant that when I mentioned, cautiously, to an aunt at a cookout that Diane still owed me money from a loan 2 years earlier, the response wasn't concern, it was mild confusion, followed by, "Well, you know how hard things have been for her." The story had inoculated her in advance. Any complaint I raised got measured against a decade of curated sympathy, and it lost every time. I mention this because if you're watching this and thinking about a similar situation in your own family, the social architecture matters as much as the financial one. Predatory behavior inside a family survives on the willingness of everyone around it to protect a comfortable story instead of an uncomfortable pattern. That mythology is also, incidentally, exactly why documentation ended up mattering so much more than testimony once the case actually began. My attorney told me early on that she expected Diane's biggest asset in any dispute wouldn't be a clever legal argument, it would be decades of built-up credibility with everyone who might otherwise have believed me sooner. A bank statement doesn't care how good someone's reputation is, neither does a county recorder's office. That's precisely why the paper trail became the entire strategy rather than one piece of it. There's one more moment I want to include because it's small, and I think smallness is exactly why it worked. When I was 27, Diane asked to borrow my card, just this once, to book a hotel for a work trip, promising to transfer the money the same day. She did transfer it, $340, promptly, almost performatively fast. I remember feeling reassured by how quickly she paid it back. What I didn't realize until years later, reading through old statements with fresh eyes, is that this fast, clean, tiny repayment established something much more valuable to her than the $340 itself: proof of concept. It taught both of us, in a small, low-stakes way, that borrowing from my accounts was normal, safe, and reliable. Every larger request afterward inherited the credibility of that first, perfectly repaid $340. Financial predators, family or otherwise, often builds trust with small, clean transactions before ever attempting a large, messy one. It's the same principle a con artist uses when they let you win a little on the first hand of cards. The unraveling started with something almost embarrassingly small, a rejected mortgage pre-approval. My husband Dan and I had been house hunting for 8 months. We had good jobs, solid savings, no visible red flags, or so we thought. When our loan officer called to tell us our application had been flagged for high utilization on an unreported credit line, I assumed it was a clerical error. I'd never opened a line of credit I didn't know about. I pulled my full credit report that same night, and there it was, a Capital One card opened when I was 29, the exact window of that hospital stay, with a $14,000 balance, 31% utilization, and a payment history riddled with late marks going back years. Late marks I had never seen, on a card I never used, tied to an account I never opened. And that's when I found the smoking gun. Not the final one, the first one. I called Capital One's fraud department that night. It took 40 minutes on hold before I reached an actual human, and when I finally did, she asked for the last 4 digits of the Social Security number on file, the mailing address associated with the account, and the phone number. The SSN matched mine. The address did not. The address on file was my mother's house. I remember exactly where I was sitting when she read that address back to me, on the edge of my bed, laptop balanced on my knees, Dan half asleep beside me, and I remember the specific physical sensation of the room tilting slightly, the way it does right before you're about to be sick. Not because the number was catastrophic yet. $14,000 in isolation was recoverable. It was the address. The address meant it wasn't a stranger. It wasn't some overseas fraud ring that had scraped my information off a data breach. It was mail arriving at a kitchen table I'd eaten dinner at my entire childhood. The Capital One representative, to her credit, was kind and direct. She told me the account showed a hospital window origination date, confirmed the address had been changed roughly 18 months after opening to my actual address, which explained why I'd never once seen a statement, and flagged the account for a formal fraud investigation on the spot, opening what would become case number 1 of eventually 4 separate fraud cases across different institutions. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table until nearly 4 in the morning with a legal pad, writing down every financial conversation with my mother I could remember across the past decade, trying to figure out how far back this actually went. That legal pad, messy as it was, became the rough skeleton of the evidence folder that would eventually run to over 400 pages. Once I knew to look, I stopped trusting my own assumptions about my financial life entirely, and I started pulling everything. All 3 credit bureaus, Equifax, Experian, TransUnion, every statement from every account I'd ever had a family member touch. Old joint account records from the bank where Diane had held my $9,000 down payment savings. Here's what I found, laid out the way my forensic accountant eventually organized it for the report we'd submit to law enforcement. The unauthorized Capital One card, opened using my identity during a 6-day window when I had no legal capacity to consent, balance grown to $14,780 with interest and fees. The held savings account, the $9,000 I'd deposited for a condo down payment, had been drawn down to $340 over 3 years, with withdrawals matching dates of Diane's own credit card payments, a timeshare deposit, and, this one stung, a cruise. 4 emergency loans, totaling $61,000, none documented, none repaid, most triggered by a manufactured crisis, a foreclosure that, when I later checked county records, was never actually filed. A vehicle loan, a 2021 SUV financed in my name with my mother as the primary driver, $31,600 outstanding, 7 months of missed payments already dragging my credit score down before I even knew the loan existed. Miscellaneous unauthorized charges on the fraudulent Capital One card and 1 additional store credit card, opened the same way. clothing, a mink-trimmed coat, veterinary bills for a dog that wasn't mine, and a $6,200 loan to a man Diane had been dating that she'd apparently guaranteed using my credit. Total, $187,340, not counting the early withdrawal penalty on my retirement account, not counting the interest and fees still accruing every single day I hadn't caught it. The emotional damage doesn't show up on a credit report, but I want to name it anyway, because if you're watching this and you recognize any part of your own story in mine, I want you to know it's real. There's a specific kind of vertigo that comes from realizing the person who raised you has been treating your identity as a resource to extract from, rather than a person to protect. It reorganizes every memory you have. Every birthday card gets reread with new eyes. Every "I only want what's best for you" gets recompiled into something colder. The vehicle loan was, in some ways, the discovery that hurt worst because of how it surfaced. I found it not through a bank call or a credit report line item, but through a photograph. Posted a picture on social media roughly a year earlier, standing next to a new SUV, captioned, "Finally treated myself, you only live once." At the time, I'd liked the post without a second thought. Sitting at my kitchen table with the credit report open, I recognized the license plate in the background of that photo from a DMV registration lookup I'd run that same night, cross-referencing the VIN listed on the loan documentation. The car in her celebratory photo, the one she'd treated herself to, was financed entirely in my name at an interest rate several points higher than what my actual credit score would have qualified for, because the dealership had run the application through a subprime lender that didn't ask many questions about who would actually be driving the vehicle. I did what I think most people in my position would do first. I called her. I laid it all out. Calmly, I thought, though Dan later told me my hands were shaking the entire call, and asked her directly, "Did you open a credit card in my name?" Her response is worth transcribing almost exactly, because it's a masterclass in the deflection tactics financial abusers use, and I promise you'll recognize this pattern, even if the specific dollar amounts in your life are different. She didn't deny it outright. She reframed it. "I was going to tell you. I was going to pay it back before you ever noticed. You're acting like I stole from a stranger. I'm your mother, Renee. Everything I have was always going to be yours anyway. Why does it matter whose name is on it?" When I pushed back, when I said this wasn't a philosophical question about inheritance, it was fraud, she pivoted immediately to being the victim. She reminded me of every sacrifice she'd made raising me and Mark alone. She brought up a car accident from when I was 14 that had nothing to do with any of this. She cried, she hung up on me twice and called back both times to accuse me of trying to destroy the family over money before I could get a full sentence out. By the end of that call, I'd agreed to think about how to handle this privately, meaning I had agreed to do nothing. That's the trap. That's how 11 years pass, not because the victim doesn't notice, because every attempt to address it gets immediately reframed as an attack, and the exhaustion of managing that reframe over and over becomes its own form of control. 2 weeks after that first phone call, I tried again, differently. I asked my brother Mark to join a family dinner, thinking a third party, someone who loved us both, might help the conversation stay grounded in fact instead of spiraling into accusation. It fired almost immediately. Diane had, in the 2 weeks between calls, apparently pre-briefed several family members on her version of events, that I was going through some difficulties. Kind of breakdown, that I'd always been the dramatic one, that I was likely being influenced by Dan, whom she'd never fully warmed to. By the time Mark and I sat down at that dinner table, 2 cousins and an aunt had already absorbed a narrative that recast me as unstable before I'd said a single word about the actual evidence. I remember opening my laptop to show the Capital One statement, and Diane, without raising her voice, without a single visible crack in her composure, said, "I really hoped you'd let this go before you dragged the whole family into it. in a tone so calm it made me doubt for a full 10 seconds whether I was the one overreacting. That's the specific, disorienting power of a practiced manipulator. Not chaos, but a serenity so complete it makes your own justified anger look like the disproportionate reaction in the room. Mark, to his credit, didn't take her side, but he also didn't fully take mine that night. He asked for time to look into it himself, which I understood, and which I now know cost Diane almost 4 more months to keep managing the story before the dam actually broke. I left that dinner having accomplished almost the opposite of what I intended. Instead of building an ally in the room, I'd walked directly into a narrative Diane had already preloaded, and I'd spent the whole car ride home replaying every word, wondering if I'd somehow proven her point simply by showing up with a laptop and a stack of statements. Dan, driving, let me sit with it for a few minutes before saying quietly, "You noticed she never actually denied it, though. Not once. She just made it about tone." He was right. In an entire evening of defending herself, Diane had never once said the words, "I didn't do this." That absence, small as it seemed that night, became something I kept coming back to in the months ahead. I want to be honest about the period between that dinner and the moment I actually started building a formal case, because it wasn't immediate. For roughly 3 months, I did nothing but ruminate. I lost sleep. I found myself rereading old text messages from Diane, looking for evidence of intent I could point to, and finding instead a decade of birthday wishes and grocery list favors that made the fraud feel almost impossible to reconcile with the person who'd sent them. I also want to name something that I think a lot of people in similar situations feel but rarely say out loud. For a stretch of those 3 months, I genuinely considered dropping it entirely. Not because I doubted the evidence, by that point the Capital One statement alone was undeniable, but because I was afraid of what pursuing it would cost me. I pictured holidays without her. I pictured my kids asking why they didn't see their grandmother anymore, and not having a version of the answer that didn't sound like an accusation. I pictured extended family choosing sides, and I already had a reasonable guess as to which side most of them would choose, given 30 years of Diane's carefully maintained reputation. The fear of losing a family, even a family that had already, functionally, been extracting from me for over a decade, is a real and rational fear, and I don't think it's helpful to pretend it wasn't part of my decision-making. Dan, more than anyone, is the reason I eventually moved from rumination to action. He's an operations analyst by trade, methodical in a way I've always admired, and one night, watching me spiral over a printed bank statement for the 4th time that week, he said something that reframed the entire problem for me. "You're trying to solve a family question with family tools. This isn't a family question anymore. It's a financial one. Treat it like one." That sentence is, honestly, the real beginning of Act 3. I want to give Diane her due here in the most clinical sense possible, because understanding how she operated matters for the investigation section coming up. She was careful. She used the hospital stay power of attorney window specifically because it gave her legitimate documented access to my information for 6 days, a window she could point to later, if ever questioned, as helping while you were incapacitated. She changed the mailing address on the fraudulent card back to my actual address roughly 18 months in, which meant the earliest statements, the ones that would have shown the fraud fastest, never crossed my desk. She made minimum payments on some of the emergency loan cards herself for the first year or two, just enough to keep them from going delinquent and triggering alerts, before quietly letting them lapse once she assumed I'd never check. And critically, she never asked for cash in a way that would show up as a single suspicious withdrawal. Every transfer was broken into smaller, more explainable pieces. $4,000 here for her roof, $6,000 there for Mark's tuition, a claim I'd later confirm with my brother that he'd never received a cent of. This is a pattern forensic accountants call structuring, and it's specifically designed to stay under the radar of the automated fraud detection thresholds banks use. There was also, I'd eventually learn, a layer of digital housekeeping. Diane had set up e-statement delivery to an email address I didn't recognize,
a variant of my own name, one letter off, that I'd never created and didn't know existed until the fraud investigator read it back to me over the phone. She'd registered it herself, using my name and a recovery phone number that traced back to a prepaid phone, likely purchased specifically for this purpose. It's a small detail, but it told my attorney something important about intent. This wasn't a spontaneous decision made in a moment of desperation. Setting up a look-alike email address and a dedicated phone number takes premeditation. It takes planning. It undercut almost completely the "I was going to pay it back, I just got overwhelmed" narrative Diane leaned on so heavily in every conversation we'd had. By the time that first phone call ended, I understood two things clearly. First, that my mother was never going to voluntarily make this right. Second, that if I wanted my money back, and by this point it wasn't only about the money, it was about being believed, I was going to have to build a case strong enough that neither she, nor a bank, nor a courtroom could talk their way around it. That's when I stopped being a daughter trying to have a hard conversation and started being an investigator. The first thing I did, on the advice of a friend who'd gone through a divorce involving hidden assets, was stop talking to Diane about any of it, at all, until I had a paper trail strong enough to stand on its own. I opened a folder, physical at first, then digitized, and I labeled it, only half joking, evidence. Every financial abuse case I learn lives or dies on documentation, because emotional testimony alone rarely moves banks, prosecutors, or judges. Numbers move them, dates move them. Signatures, or the conspicuous absence of a real one, move them. This shift in identity mattered more than I expected it to. For 11 years, I'd approached every financial conversation with Diane as her daughter first, hoping to be understood, hoping the relationship itself would eventually correct the imbalance. The moment I started approaching it as an investigator instead, gathering facts without needing her to validate them, something in me settled. I wasn't waiting for her to admit anything anymore. I was simply going to find out what was true, on my own, with or without her cooperation. Over the next 6 weeks, working mostly at night after my kids were asleep, I assembled what my eventual attorney called one of the more thorough personal audits she'd seen from a non-professional. Here's exactly what that process looked like, because if you're in a similar situation, this is close to a blueprint. Step 1. Full credit reports, all 3 bureaus. Under federal law, you're entitled to free reports through annualcreditreport.com, and after a fraud flag, you can request additional free reports. I found the Capital One card and one additional store card I hadn't caught the first time, a $2,900 balance at a home goods retailer, also open during the hospital stay window. Step 2. Bank statements going back 7 years, which most banks will provide, sometimes for a small fee, sometimes through their online portal if the account is still open. I cross-referenced every transfer to Diane's known accounts, which I identified through old Venmo and Zelle history. Payment apps keep remarkably detailed, time-stamped records, and they became some of the most valuable evidence in the entire case. Step 3. The vehicle loan. I requested the original loan application from the lender, citing my rights under the Fair Credit Reporting Act to dispute an account I hadn't authorized. The application listed my name, my social security number, and, this was the detail that made my stomach drop, a signature that was not mine, not close, not a forgery skilled enough to fool anyone who'd actually seen my handwriting. That signature, more than almost anything else, became central to the case, because forging a signature on a financing application isn't a family dispute. It's a federal offense. Step 4. County records. Remember the foreclosure Diane claimed was forcing her to ask for $22,000? I pulled county recorder records, public, free, searchable online in most jurisdictions, and confirmed no foreclosure filing had ever existed on her property in that timeframe. The mortgage crisis that justified the largest single loan in the entire scheme was fabricated. Step 5. Witnesses.
My brother Mark, once he understood what I'd found, was devastated but cooperative. He confirmed he'd never received the tuition loan Diane had used to justify one of the transfers, and he agreed to provide a signed statement. My aunt, Diane's own sister, quietly admitted she'd suspected something for years after Diane had asked to borrow money from her using a strikingly similar emergency mortgage story 2 years earlier. Step 6, social media and public records, cross-referenced by date. This step is the one I'd recommend most to anyone starting a similar process because it's free and it's often the fastest way to establish a timeline. I built a simple spreadsheet, one column for every dollar amount and its stated purpose, one column for the date, and a third column where I logged anything public I could find from around that same date: a social media post, a public purchase record, a vehicle registration, property filing. Lining those columns up side by side was often more damning than any single document on its own, because it showed in stark visual terms how consistently the stated purpose of a transfer diverged from what actually happened to the money in the days and weeks that followed. And that's when I found the smoking gun, the real one, the one that changed everything. Buried in an old joint accounts transaction history from 6 years earlier, I found a wire transfer memo typed by Diane herself when she initiated the transfer online that read, "Loan repayment will not need to disclose to R." She had, in her own words, in a time-stamped bank record she apparently never expected me to see, documented her own intent to conceal a transaction from me. That single line item did more to establish intent than almost anything else in the case. At this point, with roughly 4 inches of printed documentation and a growing digital file, I did 3 things in quick succession. I hired a forensic accountant who specializes in exactly this kind of family financial abuse case and who took my raw documents and organized them into a clean, chronological damages report, the kind of document a court actually wants to see as opposed to a folder of receipts. I hired an attorney specializing in financial elder and family fraud. And I want to note, Diane wasn't elderly by the technical definition, but many of the same legal frameworks around undue influence and fiduciary abuse of trust still applied given the power of attorney window she'd exploited. And I filed an identity theft report with the FTC through identitytheft.gov, which generates an official FTC identity theft report, a document that carries real legal weight, allows you to place extended fraud alerts and freezes on your credit, and critically gives law enforcement something formal to act on rather than a private family dispute. My attorney was blunt with me in our first real strategy meeting. "You have 2 paths that aren't mutually exclusive," she said. "Civil, to get your money back, and criminal, if the local prosecutor's office decides to pursue it, given the forged signature and the interstate wire activity, which can also bring in federal jurisdiction." She told me, honestly, that criminal charges against a parent are notoriously difficult to get prosecutors to pursue. Family fraud is chronically under-prosecuted, in part because so few victims ever build a case complete enough to hand a DA's office. Mine, she said, was close to a rare exception. I mentioned earlier that Mark's response at that first family dinner was neither full support nor full denial. He asked for time. I want to tell you what happened when I went back to him roughly 2 months later, this time not with a hurt sister's version of events, but with an investigator's. I didn't lead with emotion. I laid out the credit report, the county records disproving the foreclosure, the wire transfer memo, in the same order I laid them out for you in this video. I watched something shift in his face partway through. The specific moment, he told me later, was the county records, because that was the piece that couldn't be explained away as a misunderstanding between mother and daughter. A foreclosure either exists in public county filings or it doesn't. That one uncomplicated, verifiable fact did more to bring my brother fully onto my side than anything emotional I could have said. Mark's signed statement confirming he'd never received the tuition loan Diane had used to justify one of the transfers became one of the more quietly devastating pieces of evidence in the eventual case, precisely because it came from her other child, someone with no financial stake in discrediting her and every emotional incentive not to. I won't pretend this stretch of the story was clean or fast. There were real moments where it nearly fell apart. Near miss 1. When I placed a formal fraud dispute on the Capital One account, Diane found out. I still don't know exactly how, though I suspect she'd kept a spare key to a filing cabinet I thought was secure, and she preemptively paid down $4,000 of the fraudulent balance in cash at a branch, apparently hoping it would look like an authorized user simply catching up on payments and that I'd drop the dispute out of guilt or confusion. It almost worked. My first instinct, seeing that payment, was relief, followed immediately by doubt whether I was overreacting. My attorney had to walk me back from that spiral, reminding me that a partial payment doesn't erase the original fraud. If anything, in this case, it strengthened it, because Diane had no legitimate access to make that payment through, meaning she'd had to physically visit a branch and misrepresent her authority to do it.
Near miss 2. Diane retained her own attorney once the fraud dispute letters started arriving, and that attorney sent a cease and desist claiming the money had been gifted, not stolen, and threatened a defamation countersuit if I continued characterizing the transactions as fraud to any third party, including family members. This is an extremely common tactic, using the threat of a countersuit to intimidate a victim into silence, and it very nearly worked on me emotionally, even though my attorney was confident it had almost no legal footing, given the documented forged signature and the recorded intent to conceal. Near miss 3, and the closest call of all, roughly 3 weeks before the workplace incident I opened this story with, Diane attempted to refinance the fraudulent SUV loan under a debt consolidation program, which would have paid off the existing loan using new financing, also inadvertently still tied to my identity, and effectively laundered the debt into a fresh account with a different paper trail, potentially complicating the fraud case significantly. It was caught, almost by accident, because the fraud alert I'd placed with the credit bureaus months earlier flagged the new application, and the lender called the phone number on file, which, because of that fraud alert, was mine, not hers. That call is what told me she knew the walls were closing in, and it's what I believe pushed her 3 weeks later into the desperate, public, almost theatrical move of showing up at my workplace. I want to slow down for a moment here because the legal mechanics matter, and because if any of you are in a similar situation, this section might be the most immediately useful part of the whole story. My attorney structured our approach around 3 parallel tracks, running at the same time rather than sequentially, which she told me was the single biggest factor in how quickly the case ultimately resolved. Track 1 was the credit dispute process itself, formal written disputes to each bureau and each creditor, citing the FTC identity theft report, requesting removal of the fraudulent accounts and any associated late payment marks. Under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, creditors are required to investigate disputes within a defined window, typically 30 days, and an FTC identity theft report significantly strengthens a consumer's position in that process because it's a sworn federal document, not just a personal claim. Track 2 was the civil claim, built around theories of conversion, meaning the unauthorized use of my funds and credit, fraud, and breach of the fiduciary duty created by the power of attorney arrangement during my hospital stay. My attorney explained the case hinged heavily on demonstrating Diane had exceeded the narrow scope of that temporary authority, which is exactly what the forged loan signature and the concealed wire memo helped establish beyond any real dispute.
Track 3 was engagement with local law enforcement and the district attorney's office, which, candidly, my attorney warned me was the least certain of the 3. Prosecutors' offices are often reluctant to pursue intra-family financial cases, partly due to limited resources, partly because victims frequently decline to cooperate once charges are filed, out of guilt or renewed family pressure. My attorney told me point blank that the completeness of my documentation, the forensic accounting report, the county records, and the witness statements put the case in a stronger position than the vast majority of cases that cross a DA's desk, most of which arrive as a verbal complaint with no supporting paperwork at all. I sat in on the meeting where my attorney presented the case to an assistant district attorney, and I remember being surprised by how procedural it felt, compared to how emotionally I'd been carrying the whole thing for months. The ADA flipped through the forensic accounting binder for maybe 15 minutes, asked a handful of clarifying questions about the power of attorney window and the forged signature specifically, and then said something I've thought about often since. Most of what comes through this door is somebody's word against somebody else's. This is a paper case. Paper cases are the ones we can actually win. That single comment did more to validate the previous 4 months of nights spent hunched over statements than almost anything else in the entire process. I want to give real credit to the forensic accountant I hired, because her work turned a chaotic pile of statements into something a judge could actually follow in 20 minutes. She built what's called a flow of funds analysis, a chronological table tracing every dollar from its source account through any intermediate accounts to its ultimate destination, with a plain English description attached to each line. That format did something my raw folder of printouts never could. It made the pattern visually undeniable. 11 years of scattered transactions, once organized chronologically, stopped looking like isolated favors and started looking exactly like what they were, a sustained, structured extraction. She also flagged something I'd missed entirely, a pattern of transactions kept just under reporting thresholds banks are required to flag automatically. That structuring pattern, she explained, is something regulators and prosecutors take seriously in its own right, independent of the underlying fraud. My attorney also prepared me, realistically, for the version of this story where Diane didn't fold, where she fought the civil claim all the way to trial, dragged out discovery for a year or more, and forced me to relive every transaction in a deposition. I want to include that possibility here because it's the honest version of what building a case like this actually requires. You commit to it without knowing in advance that the other side will eventually back down. What ultimately changed the calculation, my attorney told me afterward, wasn't any single piece of evidence, it was the cumulative weight of all of it arriving at once, through her own attorney in a demand letter she couldn't spin, dismiss, or emotionally maneuver her way around the way she had every private conversation for the past decade.
I want to go back now to the moment I opened this story with, because by the time it happened, I understood something Diane did not. She wasn't ambushing a vulnerable daughter anymore. She was ambushing a woman with a case file. It was our quarterly all-hands meeting, 41 people in the room, my director standing at the front with a slide deck on the screen. Diane walked in through our unlocked lobby. This was before we tightened visitor policy, which, incidentally, became one of several policy changes at my company after that day, wearing the mink-trimmed coat purchased on the fraudulent card, and she announced loudly enough for the entire room to hear that I was a liar and a thief who'd stolen from her own family. I want to describe the 10 seconds before I responded, because I think they matter more than the sentence itself. My whole body went cold, the exact same physical reaction I remembered from the night of the Capital One phone call. 41 faces turned toward me. My director stopped mid-sentence. Someone near the back audibly gasped. In a different version of my life, the version that existed before 4 months of building a case, I know exactly what I would have done. I would have apologized. I would have found some way to smooth it over, to protect her from the consequences of her own performance, because that had been my role for 36 years. I felt that old reflex rise in my chest, fast and automatic, and I want you to know how close I came to following it. I didn't pry. I didn't yell back. I said one sentence, and I want you to sit with how much restraint it took to keep it to one sentence. Everyone in this room is welcome to know that I have an active fraud case with the FTC and my bank naming you as the suspect, and I'd strongly recommend you speak to my attorney rather than my coworkers. The room went completely silent. Diane's expression in that moment is something I'll remember for the rest of my life. Not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. For the first time in my adult memory, I watched her genuinely not have a next line ready. No preloaded explanation, no pivot to victimhood, just a beat of visible, unscripted confusion, before security, alerted by someone near the door, arrived and asked her to leave. Security escorted her out within 4 minutes. My director, to his credit, pulled me aside afterward not to reprimand me, but to ask if I was okay, and to tell me the company would support whatever I needed. Several coworkers later told me privately that the confidence in that single sentence told them everything they needed to know about who was actually telling the truth in that room. One woman from our finance team, someone I barely knew at the time, sent me a message that afternoon that I still have saved. I don't know the details, and it's none of my business, but I've dealt with a parent like that. Whatever you need, I'm in your corner. What Diane didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that her public outburst became evidence too. My attorney later used a written account of the incident, corroborated by 4 coworkers willing to provide statements, to demonstrate a pattern of intimidation.
Harassment, which strengthened both the civil case and eventually a request for a restraining order. In trying to publicly destroy my credibility one last time, Diane had, in front of 41 witnesses and a security camera pointed directly at the lobby doors, handed me exactly the kind of corroborated, third-party evidence that a he-said-she-said family dispute almost never gets. The civil case moved faster than my attorney initially expected, largely because the evidence was so thoroughly organized. Diane's own attorney, once he reviewed the forensic accounting report, the forged loan signature, the concealed wire transfer memo, the fabricated foreclosure story, the county records disproving it, advised her to settle rather than risk a judgment plus punitive damages at trial. We settled the civil claim for $196,000, the original $187,340, plus a portion of legal fees and the early withdrawal penalty from my retirement account, structured as a judgment secured against a lien on Diane's home, since she didn't have liquid assets to pay it outright. That lien meant that if she ever sold or refinanced the house, my recovery came first, before any of her own equity. On the criminal side, the local prosecutor's office, given the forged signature on the vehicle financing application and the interstate nature of some of the credit transactions, filed charges. Diane ultimately pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of financial exploitation and identity fraud, avoiding a trial, and was sentenced to 5 years of probation, mandatory restitution payments on top of the civil judgment, and, because of the workplace incident and the pattern of harassment my coworkers' statements documented, a formal no-contact order, barring me from my home, my workplace, and my children's school. I was in the courtroom the day she entered her plea, and I want to describe it honestly because it wasn't the cinematic moment you might expect from a story like this one. There was no outburst, no dramatic reveal, just a small fluorescent-lit room, a court reporter typing quietly, and my mother, in a gray cardigan I didn't recognize, answering yes to a series of procedural questions from a judge who had clearly presided over 100 cases that week and would preside over 100 more. I remember expecting to feel triumphant. What I actually felt was quieter than that, something closer to relief, the specific exhaustion of finally setting down a weight I'd been carrying, some days without even realizing it, for 11 years. My victim impact statement, which I was permitted to read before sentencing, was 3 paragraphs long. I'd written and rewritten it at least a dozen times, cutting anything that sounded like it was reaching for sympathy rather than simply stating fact. The final version focused almost entirely on the practical toll. The retirement penalty, the delayed home purchase, the 2 years of unexplained financial anxiety I now understood had a specific, documentable source. My attorney told me afterward that judges tend to respond more to that kind of restrained factual statement than to an emotional one, and whether or not that's universally true, it felt true that day. The judge referenced my statement directly when explaining the restitution order.
Here's the twist I promised you at the start of this video. And it's the detail that, honestly, took the longest for me to sit with. When the forensic accounting report was finalized, we could trace roughly $61,000 of the total, the largest single chunk outside of the direct debt accounts, to a man Diane had been dating on and off for nearly 4 years. A man neither Mark nor I had ever formally met. Payments to his own credit accounts, a down payment on a truck registered in his name, that $6,200 loan I mentioned earlier, guaranteed on my credit, was money handed directly to him, with no loan agreement of his own with Diane, and as far as we could ever determine, no expectation of repayment to her either. My mother wasn't stealing from me to survive. She wasn't stealing to cover a mortgage that didn't actually exist. She spent over a decade extracting money from her own daughter's identity, in part to fund a relationship she never once introduced to her family. We only found the pattern because the forensic accountant flagged a recurring recipient in the wire and transfer data, the same account number appearing across 3 separate emergency transactions that had each been justified with a completely different story: a roof, a medical bill, a car repair. 3 different explanations, 1 identical destination account. When we ran that account number, it traced to a joint checking account belonging to Diane, and a man's name until that point had never once come up in 11 years of family conversation. I did some quiet digging of my own after that, the kind any of you could do with a public records search and an afternoon. Property records showed he'd lived at 3 different addresses over the years Diane had known him, none of which matched hers, suggesting the relationship, whatever its shape, had never progressed to actually living together, despite over 4 years and, apparently, tens of thousands of my dollars invested in it. I never learned much more than that, and honestly, I stopped wanting to. At a certain point, the specific romantic details mattered less to me than the plain fact underneath them. I delayed buying a home, taken an early withdrawal penalty on my retirement, and spent 2 years quietly panicking about unexplained financial strain so that my mother could subsidize a relationship she'd kept entirely hidden from the people she claimed, at every family dinner for a decade, she sacrificed everything for. I won't pretend that detail didn't hurt in a different, quieter way than the fraud itself did. There's something specific about learning the sacrifice you made, the retirement penalty, the delayed home purchase, years of unexplained anxiety about money you couldn't name the source of, funded someone else's rent. Today, roughly a year and a half after the settlement, here's where things stand. All 3 fraudulent accounts have been closed and formally removed from my credit reports through the dispute process, with the FTC identity theft report as supporting documentation. My credit score, which had dropped 118 points at its lowest point because of the SUV loan delinquency, has recovered fully and then some. The lien on Diane's home remains in place, and restitution
Payments, modest, monthly, court-ordered, have begun arriving, slowly rebuilding the number that started this whole story. Dan and I bought our house 8 months ago. It felt different than it would have 3 years earlier. Quieter, more deliberate. We put a lock on our filing cabinet, not out of habit, but out of policy now. My accounts are frozen by default, with credit only unlocked temporarily and manually when I'm the one applying for something. I checked my full credit report every single month, a habit that used to feel paranoid and now just feels like maintenance. There's a specific moment from the closing on that house that I think about often. Sitting at the title company's table, signing document after document, the closing agent slid over a form that asked whether any other party had signing authority or financial interest tied to my identity in the past. I remember pausing, pen in hand, and realizing I could finally answer that question honestly with a clean no for the first time in over a decade. It's a small, bureaucratic line on a forgettable form. It might be the single most satisfying sentence I've ever written on a piece of paper. I want to close this act with something smaller than a dollar figure, because I think it matters just as much. My company did tighten visitor policy after the workplace incident. Badge access is required past the lobby now, for everyone, no exceptions, a policy that quietly protects a lot more people than just me. My director, months later, told me privately that watching how I handled that morning changed how the leadership team thought about me professionally, not because of the drama, but because of the composure. I was promoted to a senior operations role 5 months after the settlement closed. I don't know for certain the two are connected, and I don't need them to be, but I noticed the timing anyway. What didn't change, at least not quickly, was my relationship with the rest of my extended family. Some relatives sided with the documentation once they saw it. A few didn't, and probably never will, because believing the paperwork would mean unwinding 30 years of a story they'd built their own piece around. My aunt, the one who'd quietly suspected something for years, has become one of the people I'm closest to now. We talk more in a month than Diane and I used to talk in a year, and there's a particular kind of relief in a relationship built on nothing hidden. One cousin, on the other hand, stopped responding to my messages entirely after the criminal case became public within the family. And I understand, even if I don't agree with, the instinct to protect the version of the family that felt safer to believe in. I've made a kind of peace with that too. You can win a case and still lose a version of your family you'd hoped to keep. Both things can be true at once. As of this recording, Diane remains on probation, living alone, no longer in contact with the man the $61,000 ultimately funded. That relationship, I'm told through my aunt, ended not long after the criminal case became public within the family. She has not attempted to contact me since the no-contact order was issued. My children, who are young enough that they mostly
remember her as the grandmother we don't see anymore, have not asked many questions yet. I know someday they will. I've already decided I'll tell them the truth, plainly, with the same documentation I built for the courts, because I never again want a story in my family to survive on anything other than what actually happened. Before I move into the takeaways, I want to give you the full case timeline in one place, the way my attorney eventually presented it, because I think seeing it compressed like this makes the scale of it land differently than hearing it spread across an hour. 11 years of access, beginning with an authorized user credit card at 18 and a co-signed auto loan at 22. A held savings account drained from $9,000 to $340 beginning at 26. A 6-day hospital window at 29 that produced an unauthorized credit card and later an unauthorized store card. A fabricated foreclosure story at 32 that produced the single largest transfer, $22,000, plus a nearly $3,000 retirement withdrawal penalty. 3 more undocumented emergency loans between 32 and 35, totaling $61,000, funneled to an undisclosed relationship. A vehicle loan, discovered by accident through a social media photo, adding $31,600. A rejected mortgage pre-approval at 36 that finally broke the pattern open. 4 months of forensic accounting, legal strategy, and evidence gathering. 1 public workplace confrontation that became corroborated evidence instead of the humiliation it was designed to be. 1 $96,000 civil settlement secured by a lien. A guilty plea to financial exploitation and identity fraud. 5 years of probation, court-ordered restitution, and a no-contact order. 11 years to build, 4 months to unravel once I finally stopped treating it as a family problem and started treating it as a financial one. If there's one thing I want you to walk away from this story with, it's that financial abuse inside a family doesn't look like the scams we're usually warned about. There's no suspicious email, no too-good-to-be-true investment pitch, no stranger on the phone pretending to be the IRS.
It looks like trust, it looks like love, or something close enough to it that you don't question it until years have passed. So here are the warning signs distilled from everything I walked through in this story, in case any part of it felt familiar to you. Watch for anyone, family or otherwise, who insists on handling your finances rather than helping you understand them. Genuine help builds your financial literacy. Control isolates you from it. Watch for pre-loaded explanations that arrive before you've even asked the question. Legitimate mistakes get explained after discovery. Concealment gets explained in advance. Watch for emotional escalation whenever you attempt to set a financial boundary. Tears, guilt, sudden health crises, or threats to withdraw affection or access to grandchildren timed.
Suspiciously close to a request for accountability are a pattern worth naming, even to yourself, even quietly. Check your full credit report from all 3 bureaus at least twice a year, especially if anyone has ever had legitimate temporary access to your identity, a power of attorney window, a hospital stay, a period when someone else handled your mail. Keep any power of attorney arrangement narrowly scoped and time-limited in writing, and revoke it formally and in writing the moment it's no longer needed, rather than assuming it simply expires informally. And if you ever do find something, don't confront first, document first. I know how counterintuitive that feels when the person involved is someone you love, but a case built on documentation protects you in a way that an emotional conversation never can, and it protects the relationship's true version of events, whatever ultimately happens to the relationship itself. And finally, watch for the absence of a denial. I mentioned it earlier, but it bears repeating as its own standalone warning sign. Pay close attention to whether a person actually says, "I didn't do this," or whether they redirect to tone, timing, loyalty, or your own character instead. In my experience, and in nearly every story like mine that people have shared with me since, that redirection is often the loudest confession available, even when it never uses the word. I know this story covered a lot of ground. 11 years compressed into an hour. 4 months of investigation compressed into 20 minutes of it. If you've made it this far, it's suspect because some part of it landed close to home. I want to leave you with the thing I wish someone had told me at 29, in that hospital bed, signing paperwork I couldn't fully read. Love and access are not the same thing, and it is never wrong to keep records even with the people you trust the most, especially with the people you trust the most. I promised at the start of this video that the educational value would be worth the watch time, so let me leave you with the actual toolkit, the specific resources rather than just the general advice. If you suspect identity theft, your first stop should be identitytheft.gov, the FTC's dedicated portal. It walks you through generating an official identity theft report, which is different from a police report and, in many cases, more immediately useful because it's specifically designed to support credit disputes and can trigger extended fraud alerts automatically. If you need your credit reports, annualcreditreport.com is the only federally authorized free source for all 3 bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. Since 2023, permanent free weekly access has been made available, which means there's no reason to go a full year without checking, the way I unfortunately did for over a decade.
If you find a fraudulent account, dispute it in writing, not just by phone, with every institution involved, and specifically invoke your rights under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Keep copies of everything you send, and send disputes by a method that gives you delivery confirmation. If the person involved had legitimate temporary access to your affairs, a power of attorney, guardianship, or simply managing your mail or accounts during an illness, pull the original documents and confirm in writing exactly when that authority ended, and revoke anything still technically active the moment it's no longer needed. If you're building a case, even an informal one, start a dedicated folder now, digital or physical, and treat every financial conversation from this point forward as something worth a written follow-up. Just confirming what we discussed, you're borrowing X to be repaid by Y date, sent by text or email costs you nothing, and if it's ever needed, becomes evidence.
And if the numbers involved are significant, a consultation with an attorney who specializes in financial fraud or elder and family financial abuse is worth the cost of the first meeting alone, even if you're not sure yet whether you'll pursue anything formally. Most offer a free or low-cost initial consultation, specifically to help you understand whether you have a case worth building. None of this requires you to have already decided what you want your relationship with the person to look like afterward. Documentation is not the same as a declaration of war. It's simply the only thing that guarantees, whatever you eventually decide, that the decision will be yours to make with full information, not theirs to manage with a well-timed story. If this story resonated with you, I'd genuinely like to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever discovered a financial betrayal from someone close to you? A parent, a partner, a sibling? What tipped you off, and what did you do? I read every single comment on these videos, and honestly, some of the most useful advice in this community comes from people sharing exactly that. If you found this case study valuable, subscribe for next week's story, and I'll see you in the next one.